Hello everyone and welcome back. What we're going to be discussing today is the concept of collective consciousness. We have been looking at how nationalism was formed and definitions of nationalism, and what we're going to do is look at specific groups and how their relationship to nationalism has developed and changed. Here's our lesson objectives for the day. And first, what we need to do is understand this definition called collective consciousness, which you'll also find in your textbook. So to have a collective consciousness is to have a group or a nation that shares a sense of similar values, beliefs, and internalized feelings about some shared experiences. So it's very closely related to civic nationalism, and it tends to develop when the people of the nation focus on their identity as a group rather than identities as individuals. So it's slightly different from civic nationalism, but it has more relationships in terms of a collective consciousness can also apply outside of a nation state, whereas a civic nation reflects a nation state. So when we're talking about Canadian nationalism, this can be quite a hard thing to define because one of our key cornerstone beliefs is multiculturalism, diversity, acceptance of other cultures. And so when we're trying to think about Canadian nationalism, we're going to be exploring that more in Unit 4, but how did we really become a nation? And so there's no real clear answer to that, but can we define ourselves by the Confederation in 1867? Could it possibly be the completion of the Canadian National Railway? So it united people across the whole country, physically was enabling people to travel and have more of a sense of exploration into other parts of Canada. What about adding all of the provinces and territories? We recently added territories, a process that actually ended even in 1999. So we're still kind of new in our development as a whole unified Canada. Or can we talk about our accomplishments in World War I and World War II? Some of the things that defined us as Canadians, whereas before we were really just seen as this little, kind of part of Britain's empire. So when we're talking about Canadian nationalism, we have to kind of think about what are some of our shared beliefs as opposed to a solid definition about who we are. So we've talked about briefly some of there are different views on Canadian nationalism. Of course, we have different perspectives towards it. Some of the accomplishments that we do celebrate in relation to our Canadian nationalism include the Battle of Vimy Ridge, which you're going to be looking at in detail in Unit 2. It was really this source of pride and almost the defining event that broke us away from being under Britain's sole control. And so having these events that we have participated in, we remember them because they're so important to who we are now as a country. So of course, Canada Day, which we celebrate every year, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, 1982, when we added in amendments to include multiculturalism, language changes to include bilingual nation officially. And so really, we are united by our diversity. It's one of our key cornerstones, but on the flip side, it can then also kind of make it hard to define who a Canadian, is, or what is their views on nationalism because we are so diverse. So there's a lot of different perspectives on it and a lot of different components and events and achievements that went into making us as proud of a nation as we are today, and therefore our Canadian nationalism. Okay, so the next group that we're going to talk about is Quebecois. So when we're talking about Quebecois nationalism, we tend to view them, some, of course, within Quebec view themselves, but not everybody, and that's important to understand. They view themselves as a separate nation within their own, what they would call collective consciousness. So we know they're not a separate nation state. They do belong to our country, but they have a separate collective consciousness, a shared set of beliefs, a culture that is very unique to them based on their unique history. And they have had quite a long, drawn-out struggle to keep and preserve their language. So when we talk about things like the Quiet Revolution and the FLQ crisis, some of these will be reviewed from Social 10 and some are in your textbook in a lot of detail. We need to understand how challenging it has been for them to preserve their culture. At times, they have been asked to assimilate and to give up their language and to give up their culture, and it was not free for them to practice and it was not supported. And so when we're trying to understand what has made them, kind of develop this shared sense of collective consciousness, we need to understand a lot of it came through their history and their sense of trying to establish and maintain their unique culture, language, and identity. Another group that we're going to talk about is our First Nations Métis Inuit. So when you see FNMI, it stands for First Nation Métis Inuit here in Canada. And again, they are a very unique, very diverse, interesting group that we have here in Canada that sees themselves as also unique groups in and amongst themselves. So our First Nation Métis Inuit as a collective consciousness has a unique, distinct identity that is a part of Canada, of course, but is also kind of a shared, separate collective consciousness as well. And so we're going to look at this quote here. It says, "We, the Indigenous peoples of the Americas, understand all too well that our survival and future is linked to the maintenance of our separate and distinct identity and to the free exercise of our inherent self-determination within our territories." And one of the interesting things is they don't mention specific land borders. It's not about where they are. It's this sense of collective consciousness that transcends borders and really has a shared sense of identity and within the separate groups within themselves too. We're going to briefly touch on American nationalism. And so some things to take away is that unlike Canada, they are a little bit more of what we would call, they're called a melting pot. So the idea is that immigrants who come into the country are kind of, the expectation is they're going to give up a lot of their cultures and they're going to exchange that for the pure American culture. And so we don't see as much of that acceptance of multiculturalism there as opposed to an assimilation into the American culture. So of course they have one official language, one type of allegiance, which is to the United States. And so they have more of a sense of independence from others. Of course, we did emerge in Canada as a colony out of Britain. And so we still have ties to the Commonwealth. We have the Queen on our money. And so we have different ties historically. And because they are a little bit more, they were a lot more adamant about getting away from the control of the British, part of their history. So understanding their nationalism is also understanding their unique steps to become an independent sovereign nation that they are as well. So there's pros and cons to that in that they have a unique separate identity, but then they also have more of an expectation that multiculturalism is not as accepted, and they do not have then, of course, as much tolerance perhaps towards people who want to keep aspects of their culture. So what are some things to think about? We've looked at the concept of a shared collective consciousness. How does this develop? In every group that we've looked at, they've had a series of historical events that have led them, both challenging and positive, to have a very distinct shared collective consciousness that has developed. Do newcomers take on the collective consciousness of their new country? That's really something that's unique to every individual. And some are wanting to adopt everything in a new country, and some want to completely hang on to their cultures and languages that were developed before they moved into a different country. So despite the diversity in Canadian perspectives, is there one shared Canadian consciousness? I think that's really something to reflect on. We do have some shared values, such as freedom and rights to every Canadian. Is there another sense of shared Canadian consciousness that you can think of? So that's collective consciousness, and we will see you next time.
If you enjoyed this video, check out our website, online.plrd.ab.ca, and visit us on Facebook, Prairieland Online Academy. You can find out all that's going on with Prairieland Online Academy.